The next 4 Sundays, as we begin a new year calendar-wise, and in January, the next 4 Sundays will be spent taking a close look at the 3 goals that Holy Conversations, which, if you're new to this discussion, Holy Conversations was a group of 13 of our church membership and pastors that met together over the course of a year and listened to God and listened to you and listened to members of our community to discern just what God was calling us to do in the next 1, 3, 5, 10, and 20 years. And upon completing that work, Holy Conversations said, "Here is your goals," and said, "This is the direction we think that God is calling our church to go." And they finished their work by sending us in a direction. And the Next Steps team, which includes some carryovers from Holy Conversations as well as some new blood, has been working over the last several months to put together a plan in order to help us follow that direction, to go in the way that we believe God is calling us. And so as part of the Next Steps team task, one of the things that the Next Steps team has done is ask the pastors to spend this time in January explaining just what it is we're going to be doing as we proceed on these, our first next steps, as we attempt to be a church that in lining up with Holy Conversations becomes a church, and I think we might have a graphic that become a church where people participate, where people know, and where people connect. And those are 3 buzzwords that have a lot more meaning attached to them, but those are most of us can really struggle to remember 3 words, including myself. And so we try to boil it down to give us 3 buzzwords that should, right, that's the one. And then we can remember the rest of it. So today we read John's account of the disciples and their little fishing expedition. This is, if we need a little bit of context, that this is after Jesus' death and resurrection. And this is the 3rd time that Jesus has gone and visited, and the disciples, in some form or fashion, have encountered the risen Christ. And when we read it in all of its context, you can almost hear, when we think about how many times Jesus has already appeared and tried to make known to the disciples what it is that is going on here and what it is that they're to be about, you can almost hear Jesus mutter before he speaks out loud and to the disciples. You can almost hear him exasperatedly saying, "What are they doing now? What are they doing? Fishing? Really?" And then you can hear almost a mocking tone as he calls to them and says, "You haven't caught anything, have you? You fishermen, you haven't caught any fish." These disciples, without a leader and a clear understanding and a constant understanding of what they are to be about, go back to doing what they had always done. What seemed familiar, at least to Peter, the leader of the bunch, fishing. They'd gone fishing. I think I was around 13 years old. 13 years old, where I enjoyed that sweet spot where I was old enough to venture out beyond the sight of my parents and beyond even our little street in our neighborhood and get on my bicycle and cross over a fairly sizable road and meet some friends from another neighborhood, a fellow I played baseball with, and we discovered, I don't remember exactly how, but one of us discovered that there's this great little fishing hole just across the street, kind of almost halfway between our neighborhoods. And so we would call each other on the telephone the night before and say, "Are you free tomorrow morning? You want to go fishing? I'll get my parents to go get the bait with me." And so I don't remember how many, I'm sure it wasn't as many as I remember, but it felt like that summer every single day we were going fishing in a neighborhood fishing hole. I'm sure it really wasn't made for fishing, but there were fish there. There were crappie, and those were kind of fun to catch. They were easy to catch. You seemed to just, the fish in there were hungry, and so you seemed to drop a line, and then all of a sudden you had a little bite, and you had a little fish, and ta-da. But what was really fun in that pond were these catfish that sat along the bottom, waiting and waiting. And so when we learned that there were catfish, we started getting bait accordingly. And we got the right bait, we started catching a lot of catfish. And it was always catch and release. It was just for the fun of it. But the funny thing about catching and releasing is that there's a whole lot more fun in catching than in releasing, especially when it comes to catfish. And if you've ever fished for catfish, you know why catfish are not much fun to release or to get off the hook. And so as we enjoyed reeling them in, we soon realized we've got a catfish on the line here. Which one of us unlucky souls is going to be the one to take it off the hook? Because none of us really liked the slimy feel, and really none of us liked the stories we heard about those who had been poked and pricked by the spines on the catfish. And so as we started to reel it in, we would have a discussion. Whose turn is it? Whose turn is it to take this thing off the hook? Go get the glove and the pliers. And then maybe occasionally we would even resort to this. None of us wanted to take the fish off the hook. The simple fact was, none of us were really fishermen. We didn't want to take the fish off the hooks. We just wanted to reel it in and let somebody else do the work. We weren't fishermen. We were just passing time going fishing. And that's true for the disciples here, too. That's true for the disciples. It's not that they knew how to do the work and weren't willing to do the work, but the truth for them is that they were no longer fishermen. Not anymore. John situates this story, this encounter, differently than Matthew and Mark's telling of a similar story of Jesus helping the disciples with a big catch. Matthew and Mark situate the story at the very beginning, the start of their stories, the start of their gospels, and the start of their work together. But John tells this story at the end, suggesting that for John and for those who would read with John and listen with John, it's really only here that the disciples begin to realize that they can no longer carry on as they had before Jesus came. Before Jesus came along and completely changed their lives. They can definitely no longer carry on now that Jesus has died and been raised, and they can for sure no longer carry on as they had before now that Jesus has died, been raised, and they've encountered him not once, not twice, but now 3 times. They have been transformed. They're no longer fishermen. They've been changed. They've been given new names, new identities, and a new job, a new purpose, and a new calling. We here at First United Methodist Church of San Marcos are at a similar place to the disciples as the rest of them came to shore. Holy Conversations, the group that spent a year, has listened and has heard over this course of a year of listening for Jesus' voice, for God's calling and leadership and guidance. And they have heard that we must gather in our nets and cast again, but this time where Christ commands. There's a funny thing about each of the Gospels and the way that the Gospels tell this story, tell the tale of their encounters and their life and their ministry with and alongside Jesus. And one thing that strikes me about how all of the Gospels portray this story is how they paint a picture of themselves. They got it wrong a lot. They told us about themselves getting it wrong a lot. They were busy with Jesus, right there with Jesus, right there. And yet, even when following the Son of God, Emmanuel, God with us, they still needed guidance and they still needed course correction from God. We are like them. We are like them. And maybe you feel it now. You feel what I think led them to that boat that day. You may feel it, or you may not know it. But I feel it. I feel the fear of failing. The fear of failing as we talk about doing new things, existing in new ways, walking in new places. I feel afraid of failing. And I feel the urge to get back in the boat and to keep doing things how I know to do them, because I think I'm at least passable at how we've been doing things. I think the challenge for churches today, and specifically for us here at FUMC San Marcos, is that you and we're not just going back to fishing. Not in just one boat. We got a whole fleet of boats to get back into. It's not just one thing, it's a lot of things. This is a busy place, believe it or not. If you show up on any given day, it's a busy place. There's a lot going on. And for many of us, myself included, I have learned to follow Jesus while and by doing these very things. So to pull out and suggest doing a new thing feels like I am standing on shaky ground. What the gospel text has to tell us about ourselves is this: we are going to make mistakes. We are going to fail. We are going to revert back. We are going to get back in the boat and go fishing when we should be about the work of Christ. But Christ is going to keep calling us. God is going to call to us and to help us to remember that we aren't just fishing anymore. That that's not who we are. Not at the core. God is calling us to something new, to something different. And so it's both exciting and terrifying. It's a little bit like reeling in a catfish. Exciting and scary at the same time. And that is where John's theme here that we are looking at today meets with the word that God has for Joshua that Jeremy read for us this morning. That as Joshua and the rest of Israel set out, and Joshua is tasked with the hard job of leading Israel into the promised land. And God's word repeated to Joshua is, be strong and courageous. Yes, this is scary. Yes, this is different. Yes, it's terrifying to think of connecting to the world as Jesus did, because we know what ended up happening to Jesus. It's scary to put away the life that you knew. But God is with us. So we can be courageous. And we can enter into a new thing, trusting in God's promises and following God's command and Christ's lead. Following Jesus. As we prepared for this week and discussed the passages for this week, Gerald reminded me of an important truth, that Joshua and Israel never really succeeded as far as the limitations that the boundaries that God put on the promised land. They never reached that full maturity. Never got all the way. But that's not how God defines success. Listen back, go back and reread the passage. How does God define success for Joshua and Israel? By keeping the main thing the main thing. The disciples used to fish. They probably still did after that. That's how they had fed themselves, and that's how they had connected to others. They were fishermen. They brought fish. That's how they ate. That's how what they probably took to market. How are you and I, how are we as First Church San Marcos reconnecting with Christ today? How are we listening to the voice of the one who is calling from the shore? How are we reconnecting with the world? How are we going to make that switch from no longer being those who fish to those who bring good news? Not just fish. To the market and to the world. So the question before us, that will be before us, is, do we settle for what we've done before? Or will we dare to follow Christ and give more people better than what they have come to know and come to expect from the people called Christians? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.